The millionaire's boy had never taken a step on his own until the day his father stumbled upon the housekeeper in a moment so startling it shifted the course of their lives forever. There are chapters in life when we convince ourselves that everything is within reach, that grit, faith, and endless effort are enough to mold the future. That was the story of Rachel Johnson, a 23-year-old black woman raised in the rougher corners of Detroit. From the time she was little, she carried a relentless belief that persistence could rewrite her family's fate. She dreamed of the day she'd graduate college, land a reliable job, buy her mother a modest home, and send her younger brother off to a university where opportunities seemed endless. Every morning before the city woke, Rachel pulled on her worn sneakers and jogged down cracked sidewalks, lined with boarded-up shops and graffiti-tagged walls. She kept her eyes fixed on the dim horizon, promising herself in silence that she would not surrender. She scavenged old newspapers and tattered magazines from bus stations, teaching herself about places she'd never seen. She signed up for every free class offered at the local church. Each lesson, each scrap of knowledge, became another brick in the foundation she was building for a brighter tomorrow. But fate is rarely a straight road. One bitterly cold winter evening, tragedy arrived. Rachel's father, the man she admired above anyone else, collapsed from a sudden stroke and passed away before dawn. His absence hollowed their small household and shoved Rachel, her mother, and her brother into a chasm of debt. Medical bills stacked like mountains. The rent came due in red notices. Her brother's tuition threatened to vanish into a dream they couldn't afford. Rachel folded away her college textbooks, her hands trembling as if she were sealing her hopes in a coffin. She plunged headlong into survival instead. She flipped burgers in greasy fast food joints, scrubbed the floors of strangers' houses, carried trays in upscale cafes, and swept stairwells in buildings that reeked of mildew. Anything that put a paycheck in her hand. Her once delicate fingers grew thick and raw from bleach and soap. Her shoulders slumped from dragging herself through midnight shifts that seemed endless. Still, she bore it all without complaint. Every dollar meant her mother's medicine or her brother's future. Yet, as the weeks blurred into years, Rachel felt caught in a whirlpool of exhaustion. Each night, she sat by the drafty window of their cramped apartment, staring at stars that blinked faintly above the smoke of the city. She searched the sky for a sign, any trace of hope. The big dreams that once filled her chest now felt crushed beneath the weight of poverty, duty, and fear. Then, on a late autumn afternoon, when the air bit like knives and her spirits were nearly extinguished, hope came knocking, literally. Their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Green, wrapped in a faded wool shawl, appeared at the Johnsons' door. "Rachel, sweetheart," she said kindly, "I know a wealthy family up on the Upper East Side who need a live-in housekeeper and nanny. They pay well, but their boy is unusual. Since his mother passed last year, he hasn't spoken a word or taken a single step. If you need steady work, I can put in a word for you." Rachel froze. She had never pictured herself working for the rich, tending to their problems while her own family struggled. Yet the overdue rent stared at her from the kitchen counter, her mother's cough rattled in the next room, and her brother's future trembled on the edge of collapse. She had no real choice. Swallowing her pride, she nodded, though dread pooled in her chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Green," she whispered, trying to muster a grateful smile. The next morning, Rachel pulled on her threadbare coat, tucked a homemade sandwich into her faded tote bag, and boarded the subway, heading north. The train rattled with weary commuters, faces blank with their own burdens. Rachel pressed her forehead against the smudged glass, watching the graffiti-scarred streets of her neighborhood dissolve into gleaming skyscrapers, spotless sidewalks, and polished cars. When she finally stepped onto the Upper East Side pavement, it felt like stepping into another universe. The broad sidewalks glowed under amber-leaved trees. Boutique windows displayed gowns that cost more than her family's yearly rent. A luxury apartment building rose before her, its doormen in crisp uniforms, standing as silent sentinels. Inside, the marble lobby gleamed so brightly it seemed to erase shadows. Rachel's palm tightened on the strap of her tote. She whispered under her breath, "For Mom. For my brother. I have to be strong." Her footsteps echoed softly as she walked down a corridor lined with polished mirrors and golden sconces. Finally, she stopped before an immense mahogany door carved with intricate swirls, the entrance to a world that would alter her life forever. The door swung open, a rush of cold air swept past her legs, and her heart thudded against her ribs. She stepped inside, dwarfed instantly by the cavernous space. A chandelier of sparkling crystal spilled light across a marble floor so reflective it mirrored her every step. The foyer unfolded like a museum exhibit. Paintings aligned with military precision, sculpted orchids standing in perfect white bloom, and a velvet runner leading toward a sleek fireplace that flickered with controlled warmth. To her left, an antique grand piano gleamed, its lacquered surface flawless, a silent reminder that music lived here in hushed perfection. Rachel's eyes flicked toward a mirror near the staircase, and for a painful instant she saw herself, thin, tired, a young black woman in a fraying coat with hair pulled into a hurried knot. She looked like a smudge of charcoal against a masterpiece of wealth. Fear gnawed at her stomach. If I break even one vase in this place, I'll owe more than 3 months' rent, she thought. Before panic could take over, a voice carried from down the hall, steady, warm, and commanding. "You must be Rachel, yes?" Rachel turned to see Mrs. Margaret Blake, a silver-haired woman in her late 50s, gliding toward her with poise. She wore a tailored navy suit, a leather-bound book tucked under one arm. Her eyes, a piercing steel blue, radiated authority, but her smile softened their edge. "Come in, dear," Mrs. Blake said, her voice soothing like a hand on the shoulder. "I've been expecting you. Don't worry. Once you settle in, you'll find your place." That gentle tone, combined with the firm kindness in her gaze, steadied Rachel's trembling knees. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt a faint flicker of safety. What Rachel could not yet know was that this threshold marked not just the beginning of a job, but the start of a journey that would change her life, and the life of a boy who had forgotten how to live, forever. Rachel Johnson had walked through many doors in her 23 years, but never one that made her feel as though she was stepping into another planet. The door before her was no ordinary door. It was a slab of dark mahogany, carved with swirls as elegant and intimidating as the gates of a cathedral. When it swung open, the first sensation was not the sight of the glittering penthouse, but the air itself. It rushed past her in a cold, perfumed gust, carrying the faintest trace of lavender polish and marble stone. The smell of money, she thought, and her knees trembled. She clutched the strap of her canvas tote bag so tightly her knuckles blanched. That bag, faded from years of use, was all she could afford. A patch sewn on one side where the fabric had frayed. It carried a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, a second-hand paperback with pages curling at the edges, and a notebook where she tracked every dollar she earned. Nothing about it belonged in this place. Rachel took her first tentative step over the marble threshold, and the sound of her footfall startled her. The click of her worn shoe echoed like a rifle crack through the cavernous foyer. She froze, almost certain someone would appear to scold her for disturbing the silence, but only her own quickened breath answered back. The foyer stretched upward like a cathedral nave, its ceiling lost in the glow of a crystal chandelier that sparkled with 100 lights. Each crystal shard caught the afternoon sun streaming in from the towering windows and fractured it into cold prisms across the floor. Rachel's reflection shimmered on the marble tiles, her thin frame wrapped in a threadbare winter coat, her dark curls tied hastily at the nape of her neck, her face pale with nerves. She looked like a misplaced sketch in a painting that had been perfected over years. For a moment, Rachel wished she could vanish back into the subway, back to the rattle of trains, the scent of oil and steel, the noise of vendors hawking pretzels for $3 a bag. That world had been harsh, yes, but familiar. This, however, was another realm altogether. As her eyes adjusted, she took in the details that made the foyer feel more like a museum than a home. 2 oil paintings, heavy with gilt frames, hung in perfect symmetry on opposite walls, both depictions of hunting dogs frozen mid-chase. At the far end of the hall sat a grand piano so polished it reflected the chandelier like a mirror. Not a speck of dust touched its lacquered surface. Sculpted orchids stood in porcelain vases on marble pedestals, each blossom so flawless it seemed artificial. Rachel kept moving, her footsteps measured and quiet, as if the very air demanded reverence. She dared not brush against the walls, or let her bag sway too widely. Every object looked as though it cost more than her family's annual rent. One misstep could mean ruin. "This penthouse," a voice said gently from behind her, "was designed by my son Matthew. He's obsessed with perfection. You'll see soon enough." Rachel turned. Standing just inside the doorway was Mrs. Margaret Blake, the woman who had hired her. Silver-haired, elegantly dressed in a navy blouse and pearls, she exuded the calm authority of someone who had long since grown used to this world of wealth. Yet there was kindness in her smile, a softness that steadied Rachel's trembling heart. Rachel nodded but kept silent. The words "obsessed with perfection" lodged in her mind like a thorn. She tucked them away, knowing instinctively they would matter later. Mrs. Blake guided her down the corridor, their footsteps muffled on the velvet runner that stretched the length of the hall. The silence in that home was not merely the absence of sound. It was the weight of unspoken rules. Rachel felt it pressing against her shoulders. When they entered the living room, Rachel nearly gasped aloud. The space was vast, with ceilings so high they seemed to scrape the clouds. Yet despite its size, the room felt frigid, not from temperature, but from the absence of life. The walls, painted in sleek slate gray, seemed to absorb warmth rather than reflect it. Every piece of furniture sat at perfect right angles. The sofa, upholstered in charcoal velvet, bore no wrinkles or dents, as if no one had ever sat upon it. A glass coffee table gleamed without a single fingerprint. The chandelier above cast its golden glow across the room like honey. But somehow the sweetness stopped short of touching the heart. What Rachel noticed most was what wasn't there. No family photographs, no child's toys, no clutter of jackets by the door or mail stacked carelessly on a counter. Nothing to suggest that life had ever spilled freely through this space. It was, Rachel thought, a velvet tomb, a chamber of perfection so complete it had suffocated the very warmth a home should hold. Her chest tightened, and she had to force herself to take a slow, steady breath. Mrs. Blake noticed her unease. "Don't mind my son if he seems distant," she murmured. Her tone was low, confidential, as if sharing a secret. "He has suffered, a great deal. But I believe one day he'll remember what truly matters beyond perfection." Rachel nodded again, though her relief was mixed with a sharper apprehension. The real master of this house was not the kind woman at her side, but the son she spoke of, a man defined by loss and encased in ice. Rachel sensed that even a single word from him could reduce another person to insignificance. Her heart thudded as her gaze shifted toward the staircase at the far end of the living room. There, standing in the half-shadows, was a tall figure. Rachel had not heard him approach, but his presence was undeniable. He was Matthew Blake, 35 years old, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, so perfectly cut it seemed molded to his body. His ash-brown hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place. His jawline was sharp as stone, his lips pressed into a firm line. The room itself seemed to pause around him. Even the air grew still. Matthew said nothing at first, only watched. His eyes, steel gray, piercing, swept over Rachel with a mixture of suspicion and expectation, as though he were measuring her worth against some invisible ledger. His gaze left her skin prickling, as if he had marked her as both intruder and subordinate. Behind those cold eyes, however, Rachel caught a flicker of something else: exhaustion, pain, a wound no one had soothed. At last, his voice cut the silence. Low, steady, almost toneless. "If my mother chose you, it must be all right." He inclined his head slightly, no more than an inch, as though granting permission for her existence. Then his words shifted, sharper. "Just make sure you don't complicate things." The statement hung in the air, both a greeting and a warning. Rachel's throat tightened, but she refused to shrink. She squared her shoulders, met his eyes for one steady heartbeat, and answered with quiet resolve. "Hello, Mr. Blake. My name is Rachel. I'll do my best." Matthew offered no reply. He turned to his mother, asking briskly about schedules and house rules, then strode toward his study. The door closed with a click so sharp it echoed through the room like the ceiling of a vault. Rachel exhaled only when he was gone. The air itself seemed heavier now. She understood. To Matthew, she was not a person, not even a caretaker. She was simply another cog in the machinery of his perfect world. A housekeeper to maintain the tomb, an outsider who could be dismissed at the first misstep. For a moment, anger and hurt flared in Rachel's chest. But then, she remembered her father's voice, a memory she carried like a shield. No matter how others see you, walk with confidence. No one can take your worth away unless you let them. She whispered those words silently to herself, and vowed she would not shed a tear. Not here, not in this icy mansion. Yet even in that first encounter, something stirred. Rachel, a young woman from Detroit with nothing but grit and faith to her name, had stepped into Matthew Blake's rigid, silent world. And her very presence, the color of her spirit, the resilience in her gaze, was already a disruption. Though neither of them knew it then, the clash between her quiet determination and his merciless defenses would ignite a battle that changed not only the life of a wounded child upstairs, but the very fabric of this velvet tomb. Matthew Blake did not simply enter a room, he commanded it. Rachel realized this within hours of her first day in the Blake penthouse. She had seen powerful men before, lawyers striding into court, businessmen arguing over contracts in the cafes where she once carried trays, but none like him. Matthew did not need to raise his voice. His very presence was an invisible cord that tightened around those near him, pulling their movements into alignment with his expectations. The first morning, Rachel woke in the maid's quarters at the end of the long hall. The little room was barely wider than her twin bed, a dresser shoved against one wall, a lamp with a bulb that flickered when she switched it on. She dressed quickly, smoothing her skirt, pulling her hair back. By 6 o'clock, she was polishing the walnut banister on the grand staircase, careful not to miss a single inch. At exactly 6:10, footsteps descended, steady, measured, deliberate. Matthew Blake appeared, wearing a gray suit crisp as if it had just come from the tailor. He adjusted his cufflinks, as though each silver clasp could determine the order of his day. Rachel froze with the polishing cloth in her hand, but he did not look at her. Instead, he stopped near the thermostat on the wall, adjusted it to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and then crossed to the window, tugging the blinds until each slat was angled precisely the same. Only then did his eyes land on her. They were as unyielding as the granite countertops in the kitchen. "That banister should be wiped down twice a day," he said evenly. His tone was not unkind, but it carried no warmth either. More like the reading of a statute than a conversation. Rachel nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." He moved on, checking the foyer table, running one finger across its polished surface. He found no dust, but his lips pressed tighter anyway, as though disappointed by the lack of imperfection to correct. Breakfast was no less a ceremony. Rachel had laid out the table with eggs, toast, and fruit. Mrs. Margaret had assured her that Matthew preferred simple meals. Yet when he entered the dining room, his eyes went directly to the toast, sliced slightly uneven. "Half an inch thicker on the left than the right," he remarked. "Unacceptable." Rachel flushed. It was bread, not architecture, yet she bit back her protest. He sat in silence, unfolding his newspaper. Not once did he thank her. Not once did he ask how she was adjusting. He ate mechanically, folding each page of the Wall Street Journal into perfect quarters, never spilling a crumb. Rachel tried to focus on her chores, but she could not shake the sense that she was being watched. She soon discovered she was right. Tiny cameras were mounted in the corners of several rooms, their lenses dark, unblinking eyes. When she asked Mrs. Margaret about them, the older woman sighed. "Matthew insists. He claims it's for security, but in truth, he doesn't trust anyone, not even the staff." Rachel felt her stomach knot. She had grown up in neighborhoods where privacy was scarce, but this was different. Here, even in silence, she was under scrutiny. Later that afternoon, she carried linens into the laundry room. There she found a laminated checklist pinned to the wall. Every towel to be folded in thirds, every sheet to be tucked at a 45-degree angle, pillowcases ironed flat without a single crease. Beside the list hung a metronome, of all things, ticking steadily on a shelf. When she asked another maid what it was for, the woman shrugged nervously. "Mr. Blake says folding to rhythm keeps us efficient." Rachel nearly laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. It was not funny. It was suffocating. Over the next days, she watched him more closely. His life was ruled by precision. His shoes were lined in a row, toes facing north. His pens, black and gold, sat in a straight line on his desk, each exactly 1 inch apart. The blinds in every room were tilted at the same angle. Even the air seemed calibrated. Never warmer than 70 degrees, never cooler than 68. And yet, behind this obsession, Rachel sensed something else. A shadow clung to him, darker than his tailored suits. Once, passing by his study, she heard his voice crack slightly as he spoke on the phone. "No," he snapped. "Do not bring up Anna again." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint catch in his throat before he hung up. Anna, his late wife. The name carried sorrow sharp enough to slice through even his armor of control. One evening, as Rachel dusted the shelves in the library, her hand brushed against a small wooden block shoved behind the books. She pulled it out. A child's toy, brightly painted, the letter S carved into one side. Clearly Samuel's. For an instant, she imagined the boy, once laughing, once running through this very room. But the toy had been hidden, out of sight, like a memory too painful to confront. The sound of Matthew's footsteps behind her made her jolt. She turned quickly, hiding the block behind her back. His eyes narrowed. "Did you find something?" Rachel swallowed hard. "Just dust, sir." For a long moment, he studied her, and she felt as though he could see through her very skin. Then he turned, without a word, leaving the room. The block weighed heavy in her palm, even after he had gone. She tucked it carefully back where she had found it. That night, in her small room, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She understood, now. Matthew Blake was not merely cold. He was a man carved hollow by grief, filling the void with rules and routines, so rigid they crushed everyone around him. He lived in fear of chaos, fear of loss, fear of anything that might remind him of the life he had once had and lost. But fear, Rachel knew, was no foundation for a home. It was a prison. And Matthew had not only locked himself inside, it seemed he had locked his son Samuel in there with him. As the days passed, Rachel began to notice the toll his obsession took on the boy. Samuel rarely emerged from his room, and when he did, Matthew's eyes followed him constantly. If the boy left a toy on the floor, Matthew picked it up instantly, returning it to the shelf. If Samuel spilled even a drop of milk, Matthew's jaw clenched. The boy shrank under his father's gaze, retreating deeper into silence. Rachel's heart ached. She saw herself in Samuel, in his wide, fearful eyes, in the way he curled into himself. She remembered her own childhood, the nights when fear crept in through the cracks of their Detroit apartment, when her mother's cough rattled through the dark, and her father's absence left her trembling. She had learned then that silence could be both shield and shackle, and now Samuel bore the same weight. One evening, Rachel lingered in the hallway outside Samuel's door. She heard nothing, only the faint rustle of pages. She leaned closer and whispered, "It's all right, sweetheart. You're not alone." The door opened suddenly, and there was Matthew, his eyes like steel. "Do not," he said softly, dangerously, "interfere." Rachel met his gaze, her heart hammering. For the first time, she did not look away. "He's a child," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Matthew's lips tightened, and for a moment she thought he would lash out. But instead he stepped back, retreating into the shadows of his study. The door closed with its familiar click, sharp as a lock turning. Rachel pressed her palm against the cool wall. She knew then that she had crossed an invisible line. The battle between her quiet resolve and Matthew's iron control had begun. And in the center of it all stood Samuel, a boy too small to fight, a boy whose salvation depended on whether she dared to keep standing against the master of this house. The first time Rachel entered Samuel's room, she felt the weight of silence press against her chest. It wasn't just quiet. It was an oppressive stillness that hung in the air like thick smoke, thick enough to make every breath feel shallow. The room itself looked more like an exhibit than a child's sanctuary. Bright pastel walls, a collection of toys neatly arranged on shelves, and a small bookcase filled with picture books, their covers unscathed, as if they had never been touched. Rachel stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the pale gray shag rug. She caught sight of a stuffed animal, a well-worn bunny, its ears tattered and threadbare, a lonely reminder of a child's need for comfort. But the toy was just that, a silent witness to a child who had no voice to ask for it. In the far corner of the room, by the window, sat Samuel, his small body curled into a ball. His skin was pale, almost sickly under the light that filtered through the sheer white curtains, and his legs were tucked beneath him like a fragile bird afraid to take flight. His blonde hair, usually unruly and wild with childhood play, lay limp against his forehead, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. He didn't move when she entered. His eyes, dark gray, too old for a child of his age, stared blankly out the window, unfocused, as though he was watching something far away, something no one else could see. The bunny, clutching tightly to his chest, was his only companion in that moment, its worn-out fabric an anchor in his silent world. Rachel hesitated at the door, unsure of what to do next. She had been a child once, had known the pain of loneliness. But this was different. Samuel wasn't just alone. He was trapped in his own silence, his own pain. And no one, least of all his father, seemed to know how to reach him. She took a step forward, then another, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to startle him. When she knelt beside him, she noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he held the bunny, the way his fingers gripped its ears so tightly, as if it might slip away from him at any moment. His lips trembled too, but no words came out, not a single sound. For a long time, Rachel simply sat there, her presence a quiet comfort she hoped would somehow seep into the boy's heart. She didn't try to speak at first. She didn't know what words could reach him. Instead, she did what she remembered from her own childhood. She reached for the tattered fairy tale picture book she always carried in her bag, the one her mother had used to read to her. Samuel didn't look at her as she opened the book, nor did he seem to acknowledge the soft sound of her voice as she began to recite the stories. But Rachel didn't stop. She continued, her voice low and soothing, telling the tale of a brave little mouse who outwitted a fox to save her family. As she spoke, Rachel noticed something, just a flicker at first. Something in Samuel's posture began to soften. The tension in his shoulders, so rigid at first, seemed to ease. His grip on the bunny loosened ever so slightly. Rachel's heart quickened, but she didn't dare hope too much. She turned the page, continuing the story. And the little mouse, though small, was clever, and the fox, no matter how fierce, couldn't catch her. There was a shift in the room. It wasn't big, but it was there. Samuel's eyes, which had been unfocused before, now seemed to catch the words, just for a moment. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, shifted in his gaze. She leaned in a little closer, but kept a respectful distance, not wanting to overwhelm him. For a fleeting moment, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He didn't look away from her, but the silence remained. He still hadn't spoken. He hadn't moved much either, but something inside her told her that she was making a connection. She wasn't sure how long she stayed there, but the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him, Samuel's small voice, rough and cracked, broke the silence. No. Rachel's heart stopped. He had spoken. The word was barely a whisper, but it was there. It was a sound. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. Samuel, sweetheart, it's okay. You're safe. She reached out her hand, but stopped just short of touching him. She didn't want to frighten him, but Samuel recoiled, his body tensing again, as if the word had been a mistake. His hand clutched the bunny harder, and his lips trembled as he squeezed his eyes shut. Rachel's heart broke, and she pulled her hand back, sitting still, watching him. The next few days passed in the same quiet rhythm. Rachel tried again, reading to him from the book, telling him stories. Sometimes she would leave little notes under the door. Nothing too direct, just small comforting words. You are brave. You are loved. Tomorrow will be a better day. But every time she tried to get closer, to connect with him, he retreated further into himself. His eyes would grow distant, his body curled into itself. The room remained as cold and silent as ever. Rachel began to understand something she hadn't before. Samuel wasn't just afraid of the world around him, he was terrified of the people in it. He had been broken, perhaps not physically, but emotionally, and the silence that had taken over his life was a shield, one that kept everything and everyone at arm's length. She asked Mrs. Margaret about it one afternoon while she was preparing tea. The older woman sighed deeply, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the boiling water into the teapot. He hasn't spoken since Anna passed. Not a word, not a sound. Doctors, therapists, they've all tried, but nothing works. I think he's built a wall around himself, a wall that no one can break. Rachel felt a chill settle in her chest. She understood that. She had seen it before. Children who, in the face of pain too great to understand, simply shut down. But Samuel wasn't like other children. His silence was suffocating, a deep well where no light could reach. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the clock ticking steadily in the silence. In the quiet of the house, she could hear the faint murmur of voices downstairs. Matthew's voice, cold and sharp, though it was muffled by the distance. Rachel didn't need to hear the words to know what they meant. Control. That was what Matthew wanted. He wanted everything in its place, every movement calculated, every decision made with precision. He believed that if he could control everything, he could protect Samuel from the pain of losing his mother. But Rachel knew, deep in her bones, that this control was what kept Samuel trapped. The next day, when she returned to Samuel's room, she found him sitting by the window again, the bunny pressed tightly against his chest. This time, however, Rachel didn't approach him with the book. Instead, she simply sat beside him, just out of reach, and let the silence stretch between them. She waited. And waited. Eventually, Samuel shifted slightly, his small body stiff but not withdrawn. His eyes flickered toward her, then back to the window. And for the first time, Rachel didn't feel the need to fill the space with words. She let the silence sit between them like an old friend. It was a small victory, but it was something. Samuel wasn't looking away. He wasn't retreating. He was simply being. And in that moment, Rachel understood. Samuel's world wasn't one that could be rushed. It wasn't a world that could be fixed with stories or promises. It was a world that required patience, quiet, and trust, things that had been absent for far too long. As she sat beside him, Rachel made a vow to herself. She would break through. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it was, she would find a way into Samuel's silent world. She would be the one who stayed. Because sometimes, just being there was enough. The penthouse, once an oasis of cold perfection, now seemed to hum with an undercurrent of tension. The marble floors, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected not only the light, but the shifting storm of emotions between Rachel and Matthew. She could feel it in the air, the subtle but unmistakable change between them. His eyes followed her every movement, his gaze calculating, like a chess player eyeing the next move. And Rachel? She knew she had entered dangerous territory. For the first time in her life, she was standing up to a force more powerful than anything she had ever known. Each day brought new challenges. It started small, just a comment here or there, an observation about the way she folded the towels or the way she polished the silver. You missed a spot. Don't forget the edges. Matthew's criticism was delivered with a calm that bordered on coldness, as though it were merely a fact to be stated, not a rebuke. But Rachel could feel it building, the weight of his silent judgment pressing down on her like a heavy stone. The tipping point came one evening when she was trying to comfort Samuel after a particularly hard day. She had noticed him retreating even further into his shell, his little body stiff as a board, his eyes glazed over in that familiar, distant way. He hadn't spoken in days, and Rachel was growing desperate. She decided to sit with him, just as she had before, with her worn fairy tale book. But this time, she decided to try something different, a song, something soft, something familiar to her. She began humming, the melody gentle and soothing, a lullaby her mother used to sing to her when the world outside felt too big, too harsh. For a brief moment, she thought Samuel might respond. His body seemed to relax slightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. It was a fleeting moment, one that lasted only a second before he shut down again. But it was enough. It was progress. That was when Matthew appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his body rigid. His sharp intake of breath was the only sound that filled the room, and it was enough to send a chill straight down Rachel's spine. "What are you doing?" Matthew's voice was low, too controlled, but there was an edge to it that sent a wave of tension crashing through the room. Rachel straightened up, instinctively moving away from Samuel, as though her presence had been a trespass. "I was just singing to him, trying to—" "Stop!" Matthew's command cut through the air like a knife. His eyes were cold, narrow slits of authority. "He doesn't need your emotions, Rachel. He needs to follow the treatment plan. We don't have time for your feelings." Rachel blinked, stunned by the harshness of his words. But she refused to back down. Not this time. She had seen the damage that Matthew's rigid control had done to Samuel. She could no longer stand by and watch him tighten the invisible chains around the boy's heart. "He's a child, Matthew," Rachel replied, her voice shaking but firm. "You can't just order him to get better. You can't control him like one of your objects." His jaw tightened. The air between them crackled, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Rachel had crossed a line, and they both knew it. But there was something in Matthew's eyes now, something beyond the cold mask of the businessman, the stoic figure of a father who thought he could fix everything with rules. There was fear, raw and unguarded. "Don't ever speak to me like that," he growled. "You don't know what you're talking about. I'm trying to help him." Rachel felt her heart race, but she held her ground. "You're not helping him, Matthew. You're locking him in a cage." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, loud and unrelenting. Matthew's fists clenched at his sides, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. For a moment, Rachel thought he might lash out at her, might even fire her on the spot. But instead, he stepped back, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his emotions. "I know what loss feels like," Matthew said, his voice quieter now, but still laced with that raw edge. "I lost Anna. I lost everything. Do you think I want to lose my son too?" Rachel's heart softened at the mention of Anna. She had heard snippets of the story, Matthew's wife, gone too soon. But the depth of his grief was something Rachel had never truly understood until now. He wasn't just controlling Samuel to control his environment. He was trying to protect the last piece of his heart, the last connection to the woman he had loved. But protection, Rachel knew, could easily become suffocation. And that's what Matthew was doing. He wasn't giving Samuel room to breathe. He wasn't allowing the boy to heal. He was smothering him with his own fear. "You're not the only one who's lost someone, Matthew," Rachel said softly, her voice steady now. "But your son isn't Anna. He's his own person. You can't love him back to life by controlling him. You can't protect him by turning him into a prisoner." For the first time, Rachel saw the slightest crack in Matthew's armor. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes lost their fierce edge. He looked lost, as though he were drowning in his own grief and couldn't find his way out. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried everything, Rachel. I've tried everything, and nothing works. He won't talk. He won't walk. And I don't know how to fix it." Rachel stepped closer to him, her heart heavy with understanding. "You don't have to fix him, Matthew. You just have to be there. Just be present for him, even if he doesn't show you anything back. You can't heal him by forcing him into your image of control. You need to let him heal at his own pace, in his own time." There was a long pause. Matthew didn't speak, and Rachel didn't press. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with the weight of two people standing on the edge of something neither one could quite define. Finally, Matthew exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "I don't know if I can do that," he said, almost to himself. "I don't know how to stop trying to fix everything." Rachel placed a hand gently on his arm. "You're not alone in this. I'm here too. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself." For a moment, it seemed as though Matthew might pull away, but instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they had met. His eyes were tired, yes, but there was a flicker of something else, something deeper, something human. "I don't know what will happen with Samuel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe you're right. Maybe I've been holding on too tight." Rachel gave him a small, soft smile. "It's not about holding on tight. It's about learning how to let go. Matthew nodded, and for the first time, she saw the walls around him begin to crumble, just a little. The man who had lived in the shadows of his own grief, the man who had tried to control everything, was starting to understand something he hadn't before. He wasn't alone in his pain. He didn't have to be the only one to carry it. The clash of wills between them hadn't been resolved. But in that moment, Rachel realized that this wasn't just a fight over control. It was a battle for something deeper, something that, if they both let it, might just heal the wounds that had plagued both of them for so long. The weeks that followed that confrontation marked a slow, uneasy truce between Rachel and Matthew. Their interactions, once laden with the weight of unspoken tension, began to change, if only just. Matthew remained a man of calculated silence, his every movement still wrapped in the suffocating tightness of control. But Rachel noticed the small shifts. The glances that once bristled with suspicion were now longer, softer, as though he was seeing her for the first time. He still didn't fully trust her. Perhaps he never would. But he no longer regarded her as an intruder. She was beginning to understand Matthew in ways she had never imagined. Beneath the cold facade of the businessman, the rigid father who seemed to think he could fix everything with rules and routines, she could see the cracks in his armor. They were subtle, fleeting moments, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to her, they were a sign that he was beginning to let someone in. That wasn't to say things were easy. There were days when the old, unspoken rules came rushing back, as if the house itself demanded perfection. Matthew would check the temperature in the rooms, adjust the angle of the blinds, make sure the furniture was exactly in place. But each time he did, Rachel would notice a hesitation in his step, a brief glance toward Samuel's room, as though he was wondering if he was doing the right thing. One afternoon, Rachel found herself in the kitchen, preparing lunch for Samuel. She had learned to be cautious in these moments, knowing that any deviation from the routine could be met with a sharp rebuke. As she chopped carrots for the boys' lunch, her mind drifted back to the day she had confronted Matthew, when she had seen the faintest glimpse of the man behind the walls. The father, broken by grief, who had been holding on to his son, with a kind of desperation that was slowly destroying them both. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she didn't need to look up to know who it was. Matthew. She could feel his presence the moment he stepped into the room. The air shifted, thickened, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. He said nothing at first, only stood at the entrance, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the counter. But Rachel could feel the weight of his gaze on her. She didn't look up, pretending to focus on the task at hand. Yet her heart thudded in her chest, the tension between them building once again. Then, just when she thought he would speak, he said something that caught her off guard. "Rachel," he began, his voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I don't know if I'm doing this right." She froze, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering against the cutting board. She turned slowly to face him, unsure if she had heard him correctly. His eyes were not as cold as before. Instead, they were shadowed with something deeper, something closer to vulnerability. "I don't know how to fix him," he continued, his words spilling out with the weight of frustration. "I thought if I just kept everything in order, if I followed the plan, I could protect him. But I can see it now. It's not working. Nothing's changing." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, Matthew Blake, the man who had seemed so unshakable, so impenetrable, was admitting that he didn't have all the answers. He was vulnerable, human, like the rest of them. She set the knife down, stepping closer to him. "Matthew," she said softly, her voice steady but warm. "You don't have to fix everything. You just need to be there for him." "I am there for him," Matthew snapped, but it lacked its usual force. His shoulders slumped slightly, as if the weight of his own words had deflated him. "I try, but it's like he's so far gone, like I'm losing him every single day. I can't reach him." Rachel's heart broke at the rawness in his voice. She had seen it in his eyes before, the fear, the helplessness. But now it was undeniable. He was a man consumed by his need to control, but underneath it all was a father who was terrified of failing his son. "You're not losing him, Matthew," she said quietly, her voice soft but sure. "He's still there. He just needs time." And love, not rules. Matthew didn't respond right away. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The silence stretched between them, thick with all the unspoken things neither of them dared to say. And then, something unexpected happened. Matthew let out a long sigh, the sound heavy with years of unspoken grief. His shoulders sagged further, as though he were surrendering to something. Slowly, he looked up at Rachel, and for the first time since they had met, she saw something that wasn't fear or anger or control in his eyes. There was a flicker of something else. Vulnerability. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice low and hoarse. "I don't know how to be the father he needs. I've spent so long trying to protect him, trying to fix him, that I've lost sight of who he really is." Rachel's heart ached for him, for the man who had been so consumed by grief that he couldn't see what was right in front of him. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice steady and kind. "You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with the weight of their shared understanding, the realization that they were both caught in something far larger than themselves. The battle for Samuel's future wasn't just about control. It was about breaking down the walls that had kept him trapped, both inside his own mind and in the cold world Matthew had created around him. Matthew finally nodded, his lips pressed together in something that could almost be a smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Together," he repeated softly, as if the word itself were foreign to him, but somehow comforting. The days that followed were not easy, but something had shifted between them. Matthew was still the man who demanded perfection, who checked every detail and scrutinized every movement. But Rachel began to see the cracks in his armor more clearly. She saw the moments when he hesitated, when his hand would tremble just slightly as he adjusted the blinds or checked Samuel's lunch. The walls around him were crumbling piece by piece, and though it was slow and painful, it was progress. And most importantly, Samuel began to respond. Just a little at first, but enough to be hopeful. He would look up from his book when Rachel entered his room. He would reach for her hand, tentative at first, then more sure. His gray eyes, once so distant, began to soften, as if he could finally see through the fog of his own silence. It wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't immediate. But it was a beginning. And for Rachel, that was enough. The days after the small victory in the kitchen, when Matthew had finally acknowledged his own fears, his own doubts, were neither smooth nor free from tension, but they marked a new beginning. Rachel had never imagined she would be the one to crack the armor around Matthew Blake. The man who had lived a life of icy precision, of rigid control, now stood before her in a fragile state, a man just beginning to see the world through a different lens. But for every step forward, there were 2 steps back. Matthew was still Matthew. His temper was still sharp, his expectations rigid, and his ways were entrenched in years of habit. He had not yet learned to let go of the reins entirely. He had only begun to soften, and that softness was still tentative, still vulnerable, like a house built on sand, with the waves threatening to rush in at any moment. It was enough for Rachel to see that the cracks in his armor were widening, but they were far from wide enough to allow full access. The fortress of his grief, his pride, and his fear remained, looming over them both. In the mornings, Rachel would find herself tiptoeing through the house, adjusting to the new rhythm. It wasn't easy. There were days when Matthew's glances would still make her feel as though she were walking on eggshells. His sharp eye would catch every imperfection, every stray thread or misplaced spoon. But there was something different now, something in his eyes that spoke of quiet contemplation, something almost human. It wasn't just the cold, calculating businessman she saw anymore. The father, the man who had suffered unspeakable loss, was showing through, if only in glimpses. It was a delicate balance. Rachel could see the change in Matthew, but she also saw the fragility in it. One wrong move, one careless mistake, and she feared the walls would rise again, high and impenetrable. Still she persevered, taking each day as it came, understanding that the cracks she had begun to create would take time to widen fully. One particular afternoon, Rachel found herself sitting with Samuel in the playroom, the 2 of them silently assembling a toy train. Samuel, whose silence had once been so suffocating, had begun to speak in short bursts. Words, though still few, came more often now. He was hesitant, shy, but he had started to trust her. He was starting to remember how to laugh, how to be a child again. It wasn't much, but it was something. For Rachel, it was enough to keep pushing forward. She looked up as the door opened, and there, standing in the doorway, was Matthew. His presence was no longer the sharp, intimidating force it once had been, but there was still a weight to him, a gravity that pulled the room into his orbit. His eyes immediately fell on Samuel, who, despite his progress, still sat in silence, absorbed in his train set. Rachel held her breath, wondering what Matthew would do, what he would say. "Is he—" Matthew's voice trailed off, and Rachel could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the same uncertainty he had shown when he admitted his failure to protect his son. "Is he any better?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel glanced at Samuel, who was carefully connecting the pieces of the train track, his brow furrowed in concentration. "He's doing better," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It's slow, but he's starting to come around. It's going to take time, Matthew." He nodded, though Rachel could see the frustration flickering in his eyes. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw tight, as though he were holding something back. "I'm tired of waiting," Matthew said suddenly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice rose slightly, betraying the rawness of the emotions he had kept hidden for so long. "I don't have time for time. I need him to be better. Now. I need him to be whole again. We're running out of time." The words stung, though Rachel tried to keep her composure. She knew Matthew's desperation was born of fear, the kind of fear that could paralyze a man, a father, until he no longer knew which way was up. But it still hurt to hear him speak of his son, as though he were a project to be completed, a puzzle to be fixed. Samuel was not a machine. He was a child, and children did not heal by adhering to rigid schedules or deadlines. "Matthew," Rachel said, her voice soft but firm, "he's already healing. Just not in the way you want. You can't rush this. You can't fix him by force." Matthew's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment, Rachel saw the old Matthew, the one who demanded perfection in every corner of his life, who expected results, not progress. But then, almost imperceptibly, he seemed to deflate, the harshness of his gaze softening just a bit. "I'm scared," he whispered, almost to himself, as if admitting it aloud were a betrayal of his pride. "I'm scared of losing him. I don't know what I'll do if I do." Rachel's heart ached. She had heard those words before, had lived them herself. The fear of losing someone so precious, so fragile. Her own family had lived in constant fear, fear of their lives being ripped apart in an instant. But she had learned that holding on too tightly only suffocates. "You won't lose him, Matthew," she said gently, stepping closer to him. "But you have to trust that he can heal. Trust that we're on the right path, even if it doesn't look the way you want it to. He needs love, not control." Matthew's eyes were closed now, and for a moment, he seemed to retreat into himself. Rachel waited, holding her breath, wondering if her words had reached him. She had seen him open up a little, just a crack, but it was still fragile. If she pushed too hard, he could snap back into the man who believed that perfection was the only path forward. Finally, Matthew opened his eyes, and Rachel was startled by what she saw. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I don't know how to stop," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to let go of this fear." Rachel reached out and placed a hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin, the tension in his muscles. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. We're in this together. You don't have to fix everything, but you have to trust that sometimes letting go is what will save him." There was a long silence between them, one that spoke volumes. Matthew nodded slowly, as though accepting something he hadn't been ready to face before. The walls that had separated them for so long, both physical and emotional, began to erode, just a little. "I'm trying," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I really am." Rachel gave him a soft smile, one that she hoped carried the weight of her understanding. "I know." In that moment, Rachel knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. There would still be days when Matthew would fall back into old habits. Still be moments when the walls between them felt too thick to break through. But there was also something new, something fragile and yet powerful, that had begun to form between them. It was an alliance, built on the quiet understanding that they were no longer enemies fighting for control. They were partners, united by their shared love for Samuel, both trying to navigate the darkness and find a way through. Samuel's recovery, their recovery, would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt hopeful. The path was still unclear, but she knew they could walk it together. By the time they reached Seattle, the air between Rachel and Matthew had shifted in a way neither of them had expected. The city, known for its misty mornings and towering pines, felt like a different world compared to the gleaming, perfect penthouse that had been both a prison and a sanctuary for Samuel. For the first time, there was an unspoken understanding between the three of them. The journey to Seattle was more than just a physical trip. It marked a turning point in their struggle, against grief, against fear, and against the suffocating weight of expectations. Rachel had researched every aspect of the therapy center they were visiting, the one that specialized in multi-sensory treatment for children with trauma. The idea of incorporating animals, music, and movement into Samuel's recovery was bold, but she knew it was the kind of approach that might work for him. Samuel had been trapped for so long inside his own mind, unable to express his pain. The idea of introducing him to a new environment filled with life and warmth seemed like the only way forward. But as much as she believed in this, she also understood how fragile this plan was. She knew how deeply Matthew's skepticism ran. He wasn't one to embrace something untested, especially not after the long string of failed therapies. When they arrived at the center, the first thing Rachel noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, antiseptic scent of hospitals or the harsh chemicals of modern treatment rooms. Instead, it was a fresh, earthy smell, like rain on the forest floor. It was warm, inviting, and peaceful, a stark contrast to the cold, controlled environment they had left behind in New York. Samuel, still withdrawn, clung to Rachel's side as they entered, his eyes wide, his body stiff. The world outside had been so vast and overwhelming for him, and now, even though this was a safe space, the unfamiliarity of it all was enough to make him retreat further into his shell. Matthew, ever the skeptic, looked around with an unreadable expression. He was silent at first, but Rachel could feel the tension in him. She knew that part of him was still questioning if this would work, still grasping at the last threads of his tightly held control. The fear that had consumed him for so long was still there, buried beneath the surface. But this time, he wasn't the man in control. This time, he was simply a father, trying to figure out how to help his son find his way back to the world. "I don't know if this will work," Matthew said, his voice low, his words filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. He looked at Rachel, his gaze searching for reassurance. Rachel turned to him, her hand gently resting on Samuel's shoulder. "We don't know for sure, but it's a chance, and sometimes that's all we have left." The staff at the center welcomed them with open arms, guiding them through the facility, showing them the areas where children interacted with the animals, played music, and engaged in movement therapy. It was unlike any place Rachel had ever seen. Bright, vibrant, alive with energy. There was a quiet but palpable sense of hope in the air, something she hadn't felt in so long. They started Samuel's first session with the animals. A gentle golden retriever, wagging its tail, approached Samuel slowly, as if sensing his hesitation. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, as Samuel recoiled at first, his body going rigid. But the therapist, a calm woman with kind eyes, knelt down beside him. "It's okay," she said softly. "The dog just wants to be your friend." The dog, sensing Samuel's fear, sat down beside him, its head tilted slightly, as if offering silent reassurance. Rachel could see the change in Samuel's eyes. Something softened, just a little. He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing the dog's soft fur. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Samuel's hand trembled as he petted the dog, but it wasn't the same kind of fear she had seen before. It was curiosity. It was a spark of life, slowly beginning to surface after months of silence.
Matthew stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. But Rachel noticed the subtle change in his posture. The tension that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something softer, something that resembled hope, even if it was fragile and uncertain. The next part of the therapy involved music. Samuel was guided into a room filled with soft, natural light, and a therapist placed a small guitar in his hands. The music was soothing, slow, and gentle, nothing too overwhelming. As Samuel strummed the strings, he hesitated at first, his fingers clumsy, unsure. But Rachel saw it, the tiniest spark of joy, the way his face softened as the music filled the room. He didn't play perfectly, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he was engaging with the world around him in a way he hadn't in months. It was in that moment, as she watched Samuel hold the guitar, that Rachel realized how far he had come. He wasn't healed, not yet, but he was taking the first steps. And those first steps were all that mattered. Matthew, who had stood at the door watching quietly, took a slow step forward. His gaze shifted between Samuel and Rachel, and for the first time, he spoke, his voice quieter than it had been in weeks. I never thought he'd do this. I didn't think he could feel anymore. His words were hesitant, almost as if he were testing the waters, afraid to acknowledge the change. Rachel turned to him, her heart full of compassion. He's always felt, Matthew. He just needed someone to help him find his way back. They continued the therapy sessions for the next few days. Samuel interacting with the animals, listening to music, participating in movement exercises that encouraged him to express himself through dance and play. Each day, a little more of the boy they had lost began to return. He wasn't speaking much, but he was smiling. He was making eye contact. And for the first time in months, Rachel could see the spark of hope in his eyes.
One afternoon, after a particularly successful session, Samuel surprised them both. As he sat on the floor, playing with a set of colorful blocks, he looked up at Matthew and said, "Daddy." The word, soft and unsteady, was barely more than a breath. But it was there. It was a breakthrough. Matthew froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. Then, slowly, as if the weight of the moment had finally caught up with him, he knelt down beside Samuel. Did you just say?" Samuel looked at him, his gray eyes meeting his father's, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled. The smile was small, but it was real. And in that smile, Rachel saw the future. She saw a future where Samuel could speak, could live without the suffocating walls that had once trapped him. Matthew's hand trembled as he reached out, brushing his son's hair back from his forehead. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The moment spoke louder than any words could. Samuel had spoken, and for Matthew, that was all he needed to hear. It wasn't the end of the journey. Rachel knew that. Samuel's road to healing would take time, and there would be setbacks along the way. But in that moment, they had something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. For Rachel, Seattle had proven something she had always known deep down. Healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't something you could force. But with patience, with love, and with the right kind of support, it was possible. And now, with Samuel's first words, Rachel knew that the road ahead, though still long, would lead them to a place they could finally breathe again. The rain had finally stopped by the time they arrived back in New York, but the city, still shrouded in the aftermath of its storm, felt quieter than Rachel had ever remembered it. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of change, but also of uncertainty. After everything, after the long, painful journey to Seattle, the breakthroughs, and the fragile alliance they had forged, she didn't know what awaited them back in the penthouse. But when she looked at Samuel, clutching his stuffed bunny in the back seat, his eyes no longer hollow and distant, but soft and curious, she knew something had changed. He was still quiet, still uncertain, but the spark that had been buried so deep within him was finally beginning to flicker again. It wasn't just in his smile, or in the way he looked at Matthew, but in the quiet confidence he had begun to develop. And that, Rachel knew, was the first real sign of his recovery. Matthew, too, had changed. Though the man was still guarded, still holding on to the remnants of control that had defined him for so long, there was something softer in his approach now. When they had first met, he had been a man of cold precision, afraid of losing everything, holding on too tightly to the things he couldn't protect. Now he was learning, slowly but surely, that the only way to truly heal was not by controlling, but by trusting. The days after their return were filled with small victories, some barely noticeable, some more profound. Samuel, for the first time in a long while, began to speak in more complete sentences. It wasn't much, sometimes just a few words here and there, but enough to remind everyone that he was there and he was listening. Rachel could see the changes in him, could feel the weight lifting from his small shoulders. His once pale and fragile frame was slowly filling out, his eyes less haunted. But it wasn't just Samuel who was changing. Matthew, too, was learning to adapt. The walls that had once stood so high around him were crumbling, piece by piece. There were still moments when his old ways crept in. The occasional sharp word, the fleeting glances that told Rachel he was still unsure of what to do. But in those moments, he no longer shut himself off completely. Instead, he leaned in, just a little. He started asking questions about Samuel's therapy, about the things Rachel was doing with him. He was learning to listen, and that was more than Rachel could have hoped for. It was one quiet afternoon, when the sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the penthouse, that the final piece seemed to fall into place. Rachel had been sitting with Samuel at the kitchen table, reading a book with him, when Matthew appeared at the doorway. This time there was no rush, no irritation in his demeanor. He simply stood there, watching them, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "I never thought I'd see this," Matthew said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "I never thought I'd see him like this again." Rachel didn't speak immediately. She knew that, for Matthew, this wasn't just about Samuel. It was about him, too. The guilt, the fear, the endless pressure he had placed on himself to fix what couldn't be fixed. She saw him now for what he was, just a man, a father, struggling to find his way through a world that had taken too much from him. "Samuel's not fixed, Matthew," Rachel said softly, her voice carrying the weight of what she knew to be true. "None of us are, but we're healing, together." Matthew took a step into the room, and Rachel noticed the change in his posture, the way he wasn't standing so stiff, so formal anymore. He was simply present. For the first time, Rachel felt as though he was truly there, not as a man trying to maintain control, but as a father trying to be there for his son. Later that evening, after Samuel had gone to bed, Matthew and Rachel sat together in the living room. The once cold, imposing space now seemed a little warmer, a little less foreign. The air between them was still fragile, still uncertain, but it was also filled with a quiet kind of hope. A hope that had grown from the ashes of grief, from the small steps they had taken toward healing. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his voice low, hesitant. Maybe it's time to make some changes. Maybe it's time I stopped trying to hold on so tightly." Rachel didn't speak right away. She could feel the weight of his words, the depth of what they meant. "It's not easy," she said finally, her voice steady. "But you're already doing it. You're here. You're trying. That's all anyone can do." Matthew nodded slowly, his eyes distant for a moment, before meeting hers. "I can't change the past. I can't undo what happened with Anna. But I can try to be a better father. I can try to be better for Samuel." Rachel smiled, the warmth in her chest spreading out, like the sun breaking through the clouds. "You're already there," she said simply. The following weeks brought more change. Samuel's laughter, once a distant memory, began to fill the penthouse again, ringing through the halls like the first breath of spring after a long winter. He still had moments of fear, moments where the past would haunt him, but each day he seemed a little stronger. His relationship with Matthew grew, slowly but steadily. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. For the first time in months, Rachel saw a glimpse of the father and son she had always hoped they could be. As time passed, they began to make plans for the future. Samuel was enrolled in a new school, one that would support his unique needs. And though Matthew was still hesitant about the unknown, he took Rachel's advice and made the choice to trust. The walls between them began to crumble completely, leaving behind a new foundation for their family, one that was not built on fear, but on love, patience, and understanding.
One afternoon, as Rachel watched Matthew and Samuel play a game of checkers, laughing over each move, she felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. This was what healing looked like. Not grand gestures, not perfect moments, but the small, everyday steps that led to something greater. They had all come so far. And then, one chilly autumn evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Matthew, Rachel, and Samuel, their hands intertwined, their lives forever changed, Matthew turned to Rachel, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "You've done more than you know, Rachel. You've brought us back from the edge." Rachel smiled, her heart full. "We did it together. It's all of us finding our way." It wasn't a perfect ending. No journey to healing ever was. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their home, their laughter, their love, Rachel knew that the road ahead, though still uncertain, would lead them somewhere good. Their family, once fractured and broken, was whole again, not because they had all the answers, but because they had learned to trust, to love, and to hold on to the belief that no matter how dark the past had been, there was always a light ahead, if they only had the courage to walk toward it. If you've enjoyed this story and the journey of healing, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think is the most important thing when it comes to overcoming trauma and finding hope after loss? How do you think trust and patience can help rebuild broken relationships? Drop a comment below and share your insights. We'd love to start a meaningful conversation with you. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who could use a little inspiration, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that dive into the power of love, healing, and personal growth. Together, we can create a space where hope is always within reach.